You're standing in the shadowed corridors of Topkapi Palace in 1650, your bare feet silent against the cold marble floors. The silk curtains flutter in the evening breeze, carrying with them the scent of jasmine and something else, something that makes your stomach turn with dread. You're only 10 years old, but you've already learned that childhood ends the moment you cross these palace walls. The other children whisper warnings in languages you're still learning to understand, their eyes hollow with experiences no child should ever carry. Tonight, like every night, you lie awake listening to footsteps in the corridor, praying they won't stop at your door, knowing that prayer is all you have left in a world where your body is no longer your own. This is the story of the forgotten victims of the Ottoman Empire's most prestigious palace, children torn from their families and thrust into a system designed to serve the desires of the most powerful men in the world. Behind the golden domes and intricate tilework that tourists admire today, thousands of young souls endured unspeakable horrors that history has chosen to forget. These weren't just servants performing household duties, they were children trapped in an elaborate machine of exploitation that treated human beings as objects for pleasure and political gain. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Ottoman imperial harem wasn't the romantic paradise that Hollywood depicts in movies and novels. It was a carefully orchestrated system of control that began with the systematic kidnapping of children from across the empire. The Devshirme system, as it was officially known, operated like a human harvesting machine that swept through Christian villages from the Balkans to the Caucasus, selecting the most beautiful and intelligent children for service in the palace. Imagine being ripped away from everything you've ever known at the age of 8 or 9. One day you're playing in your village, helping your mother with daily chores, learning the traditions of your ancestors. The next day, Ottoman officials arrive with armed guards, conducting what they euphemistically called recruitment, but what was really legalized kidnapping. They examined children like livestock at a market, checking teeth, feeling muscles, assessing physical beauty and intellectual potential. The selection process was deliberately traumatic, designed to break the children's connection to their former lives from the very beginning. Boys who weaned for military training as showed promise were often desk janissaries, but the girls, and some boys selected for their exceptional beauty, faced a different fate entirely. They were marked for service in the palace harem, where their childhood would be systematically destroyed in service to the Sultan's desires and political needs. The journey to Constantinople was itself a nightmare that prepared these children for the horrors ahead. Packed into wagons like cargo, separated from siblings, unable to communicate with guards who spoke different languages, many children didn't survive the trek to the capital. Those who did arrive found themselves in a world that seemed designed to strip away every aspect of their former identity. Upon arrival at Topkapi Palace, the children underwent a process that can only be described as systematic dehumanization. They were bathed, examined by palace physicians, and assigned numbers that replaced their birth names. The message was clear from the first moment. You are no longer a person with an identity, family, or culture. You are property of the Sultan, to be moulded and used according to his wishes. The palace complex itself was a maze of courtyards, chambers, and hidden passages that kept the harem isolated from the outside world. The children learned quickly that escape was impossible, not just because of the physical barriers, but because they had nowhere to go. Their families believed they were dead. Their villages were hundreds of miles away, and they no longer even remembered how to return to the people they once were. The training of harem children began immediately and was ruthlessly comprehensive. They were taught Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, not for intellectual enrichment, but to better understand and respond to their master's commands. They learned music, dance, and poetry, but always with the understanding that these skills were tools to please their owners, rather than expressions of personal creativity or growth. Physical training was equally important and far more sinister. Young girls were taught how to move their bodies in ways that would appeal to men, how to apply cosmetics to enhance their appearance, and how to suppress any natural reactions of fear or disgust that might displease their future masters. Boys selected for certain roles underwent similar conditioning, learning to present themselves as objects of desire rather than human beings with their own thoughts and feelings. The psychological conditioning was perhaps the most devastating aspect of their training. Palace instructors used a combination of rewards and punishments to break down the children's natural resistance to sexual exploitation. A child who showed compliance might receive better food, prettier clothes, or small privileges that seemed precious in such a restrictive environment. Those who resisted faced punishments that were designed not just to cause pain, but to demonstrate their complete powerlessness. The hierarchy within the harem created additional layers of psychological manipulation. Older slaves who had survived years of abuse were given authority over newcomers, creating a system where victims became perpetrators in order to maintain their own precarious positions. Children learned that protecting themselves often meant participating in the abuse of others, creating cycles of trauma that could last for generations. Medical examinations were routine and invasive, conducted not out of concern for the children's health, but to ensure they remained suitable for their intended purposes. Palace physicians checked for signs of disease, monitored physical development, and made recommendations about which children should be assigned to which roles based on their physical attributes and perceived psychological compliance. The concept of consent was completely absent from this system. Children as young as 8 or 9 were expected to submit to whatever was demanded of them, regardless of their personal feelings or physical comfort. The palace operated on the principle that the sultan's desires and those of his high-ranking officials took precedence over any consideration of human dignity or basic rights. Religious instruction was used as another tool of control. Children were converted to Islam not through genuine spiritual guidance, but through a process that stripped away their connection to their birth cultures and replaced it with a version of faith that emphasized absolute submission to authority. Prayer became another form of psychological conditioning rather than a source of comfort or strength. The daily routine for harem children was carefully regulated to maximize their availability to serve while minimizing opportunities for them to form meaningful relationships with each other or maintain connections to their past lives. They woke before dawn, spent hours in preparation and training, and remained available at all times for summons from palace officials. Food was used as both reward and punishment, with children receiving better meals when they pleased their instructors and facing hunger when they showed signs of resistance. This created a constant state of anxiety around basic survival needs, making the children more dependent on their captors' approval and less likely to risk punishment through disobedience. Sleep was often interrupted by unexpected summons, creating chronic exhaustion that made resistance more difficult and compliance more likely. Children learned to exist in a constant state of alertness, never knowing when they might be called upon to serve in ways that violated every instinct of self-preservation and dignity. The most heartbreaking aspect of this system was how it corrupted the natural development of these children. At ages when they should have been learning about friendship, family bonds, and their place in a community, they were instead learning to view human relationships through the lens of power, exploitation, and survival. Their understanding of love, trust, and intimacy was forever distorted by experiences that no child should ever endure. The palace staff who oversaw this system included many who had once been victims themselves, creating a tragic cycle where survivors of abuse became instruments of continued exploitation. These older slaves understood better than anyone the psychological techniques needed to break down resistance and create compliance, effyingly effective at making them terrorizing the system that had destroyed their own childhood. Some children developed what modern psychology would recognize as Stockholm Syndrome, forming emotional attachments to their captors as a survival mechanism. These confused feelings of loyalty and gratitude toward those who had destroyed their lives became another tool of control, making escape attempts less likely and resistance more psychologically difficult. The seasonal rhythms of palace life created predictable patterns of exploitation that the children learned to dread. During religious festivals and state celebrations, demands on harem children intensified as palace officials sought to demonstrate their wealth and power through elaborate entertainments. These events often lasted for days, requiring children to perform continuously while maintaining appearances of happiness and enthusiasm. Winter months brought different challenges as the palace became more isolated from the outside world. The cold marble floors and drafty chambers made physical comfort impossible, while the reduced daylight hours created an atmosphere of perpetual gloom that deepened the children's psychological despair. Many developed what palace physicians dismissed as seasonal melancholy, but which was actually severe depression caused by their traumatic circumstances. The assignment of children to specific roles within the harem hierarchy was a process that determined their entire future within the palace walls. Some were designated as personal attendants to higher-ranking concubines, while others were marked for direct service to palace officials. The most beautiful children faced the worst fate of all, selection for the Sultan's personal attention, which meant a life of sexual exploitation at the highest levels of the empire. Training for these specialized roles was intensive and degrading. Children learned to anticipate their master's needs before being asked, to remain silent unless specifically commanded to speak, and to endure physical and emotional abuse without showing any signs of distress. They were taught that their only value lay in their ability to provide pleasure and service to others, systematically destroying any sense of self-worth or personal agency. The palace kitchens where harem children often worked were scenes of constant activity and hidden cruelty. While preparing elaborate meals for palace officials, these young slaves had to survive on scraps and leftovers, their own nutritional needs considered irrelevant compared to the luxury required for their masters' dining experiences. The irony of children starving while preparing feasts became a daily reminder of their worthless status in the palace hierarchy. Communication between children was strictly monitored and often punished. Palace officials understood that friendships and emotional bonds between slaves could lead to coordinated resistance or escape attempts. Children learned to interact with each other through subtle glances and coded gestures, developing an underground language of support that provided some small comfort in their isolated existence. The medical care provided to harem children was focused entirely on maintaining their usefulness rather than promoting their health and well-being. Palace physicians treated injuries and illnesses only to the extent necessary to keep the children functional, showing no concern for their pain or psychological trauma. Some children were subjected to procedures designed to enhance their physical appeal or prevent pregnancies, performed without anesthesia or regard for their suffering. Seasonal illnesses swept through the cramped quarters where children lived, often proving fatal to those whose bodies had been weakened by malnutrition and constant stress. The palace response to these deaths was purely practical, removing bodies quickly to prevent the spread of disease and replacing deceased children with new captives from the latest recruitment campaigns. The education provided to some harem children was a twisted form of cultural indoctrination designed to make them more entertaining companions for palace officials. They learned to recite poetry that celebrated their own subjugation, to perform dances that sexualized their young bodies, and to engage in conversations that demonstrated their complete acceptance of their enslaved status. Writing and reading skills were taught selectively, and always with the understanding that these abilities belonged to the palace rather than the children themselves. Some learned to compose letters and documents for their masters, while others were trained to read religious texts that reinforced the divine authority of the Sultan and the righteousness of their own exploitation. The concept of time became meaningless for harem children, who lived in a perpetual present where past and future were equally hopeless. Days blended into weeks and months without any markers of normal human development or achievement. Birthdays passed unnoticed, seasons changed without celebration, and the natural milestones of childhood were replaced by increasingly sophisticated forms of abuse and exploitation. The psychological fragmentation caused by this existence manifested in various ways among the children. Some developed multiple personalities as a coping mechanism, creating internal refuges where their true selves could hide from the horrors of daily life. Others experienced complete dissociation during traumatic encounters, learning to mentally absent themselves from their own bodies during the worst moments of abuse. Sleep disorders were common among harem children, who learned to fear the vulnerability that came with unconsciousness. Many suffered from chronic nightmares that replayed their traumatic experiences, while others developed insomnia as their bodies refused to relax, even when given the opportunity to rest. The palace's response to these symptoms was typically to provide drugs that kept the children compliant rather than addressing the underlying trauma. The arrival of new children in the harem created complex emotional responses among existing slaves. While older children sometimes felt compassion for newcomers, they also understood that fresh arrivals might replace them in their master's affections, potentially leading to even worse treatment or disposal. This dynamic prevented solidarity among the victims and maintained the competitive atmosphere that palace officials used to control their human property. Some children attempted to preserve connections to their former lives through secret rituals or hidden mementos, but discovery of such items usually resulted in severe punishment. Palace officials understood that maintaining any link to pre-slavery identity made children less malleable and more likely to resist their current circumstances. The few children who managed to gain positions of relative privilege within the harem hierarchy often found themselves transformed into willing participants in the system that had victimized them. The psychological pressure to survive, combined with years of conditioning, could turn former victims into perpetrators who helped recruit and train new children for similar fates. The physical spaces where children lived reflected their status as disposable property rather than human beings. Crowded dormitories with minimal privacy, poor ventilation, and inadequate sanitation created living conditions that would have been considered unacceptable for valuable livestock. Yet these children were forced to call such places home for years at a time. Today, when visitors walk through the restored halls of Topkapi Palace, they admire the intricate architecture and imagine romantic tales of Ottoman grandeur. But beneath those polished marble floors lie the unmarked graves of countless children whose suffering built the foundation of imperial luxury. The tourists taking selfies in the harem courtyards stand where 10-year-old slaves once waited in terror for their next summons, where childhood innocence was systematically destroyed in service to absolute power. These forgotten victims remind us that history's greatest monuments often rest upon foundations of unspeakable cruelty. The children of the Ottoman harem were not footnotes to empire. They were human beings whose stolen lives powered a system that treated vulnerability as commodity and suffering as entertainment. Their stories force us to look beyond the golden facade of historical glory to confront the human cost of unchecked authority. The silence surrounding these crimes wasn't accidental. It was carefully orchestrated to protect the reputation of an empire that understood its survival depended on maintaining the myth of benevolent rule. By remembering these children today, we honor their humanity and commit ourselves to recognizing similar patterns of exploitation wherever they emerge. Their legacy challenges us to build a world where power serves to protect the vulnerable rather than consume them.